Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, your quiet companion for an unhurried hour of reason and reflection. Tell me, is there a lamp burning near you this evening? Perhaps a cup of something warm close at hand, the soft sound of paper, or simply the kind of settled stillness that invites careful thought? These are the hours Watson knew best, ink drying on the page, the world grown small and close, observation sharpening in the silence. Do subscribe and join us whenever the evening calls for a little deduction. Now, make yourself comfortable, for as the greatest observer of Baker Street understood, one must first learn to see before one can begin to understand. Chapter 1. A Fog upon Baker Street. It has been my experience, across the many singular adventures which have fallen to my lot since first I made the acquaintance of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, that the most consequential affairs often announce themselves with the least ceremony. A great case does not invariably arrive with the thunder of a pistol shot or the shriek of a woman in the night. Sometimes it arrives on a Tuesday afternoon in November, wrapped in fog, wearing a frock coat, and carrying a dispatch case from which the most important document in it has already gone missing. On this particular Tuesday I had made my way to Baker Street more from force of habit than from any specific intent, my own practice being thin that week, owing to an outbreak of influenza amongst my patients which had, paradoxically, left the healthy ones too fearful of contagion to venture out for their customary complaints. The weather had closed in overnight with that peculiar London thoroughness, which seems designed to remind the citizen that nature, for all the city's pretensions, retains the upper hand. A dense November fog had pressed itself against every window of the metropolis, reducing the familiar prospect from Holmes's sitting room to a shifting, sulphurous grey wall no more than 6 feet beyond the glass. The rattle of hansom cabs in Baker Street came to us muffled and ghostly, as though the horses moved through cotton wool rather than cobblestone. Holmes himself appeared entirely indifferent to the atmospheric oppression. He stood at his chemical table in his mouse-coloured dressing gown, his back to the room, conducting some analysis, the nature of which I could only surmise from the acrid smell of nitric acid and the faint blue flame of his spirit lamp. Several test tubes were arranged in a rack before him, with the fastidious order he reserved exclusively for his experiments, that order being notably absent from every other aspect of his domestic arrangements. The morning's correspondence lay scattered across the hearthrug, apparently having been read, deemed insufficiently stimulating, and flung there in succession. I settled into my customary armchair and took up the paper, though I confess I had read it thoroughly at breakfast and found nothing in its pages to hold my attention a second time. Mrs. Hudson had set a fire against the chill, and it burned with admirable steadiness, casting a warm and amber light across the room's familiar disorder. Above the mantelpiece the unanswered letters were pinned in their accustomed place by a jackknife. Holmes's violin lay on the sofa. The Persian slipper, in which he kept his tobacco, jutted from its shelf. Everything, in short, was as it had ever been, and I was on the verge of a doze when the step upon the stair announced that Baker Street was about to receive a visitor of some description. Holmes heard it before I did, or rather registered it consciously before I could shake off my drowsiness, for he set down his pipette without haste, turned from his table, and lowered himself into the opposite chair with the unhurried precision of a man who knows he has 30 seconds before the knock. The knock came, Mrs. Hudson's voice, then another, lower and more guarded. Holmes pressed his fingertips together and closed his eyes. The door opened upon a gentleman of perhaps 55 years, tall and well-made, with the silver hair and deliberate bearing of a man accustomed to responsibility and the scrutiny that accompanies it. His dress was impeccable, a dark frock coat, black cravat, and the kind of well-tended kid gloves that speak of a valet rather than personal vanity. Yet for all the surface composure of his appearance, there was something in his eyes, a tightness about the corners, a quality of controlled alarm which told me before he had spoken a single word that the matter which had brought him here was of no trivial character. His right glove, I noticed as he drew it from his hand, was frayed along the inner seam of the index finger. The kind of repetitive friction caused by a man who turns a ring or taps ceaselessly upon a hard surface in moments of anxiety. Holmes did not rise, but he opened his eyes and regarded the newcomer with that swift, comprehensive attention which I had long since learned to recognise as something far more purposeful than mere curiosity. "Sir Percival Ainsworth," said Holmes, "of the Foreign Office. Pray sit down and tell me how long the memorandum has been missing." The gentleman halted in the precise centre of the room and stared at Holmes with an expression in which astonishment briefly overcame anxiety. "I have not introduced myself," he said carefully. "No," Holmes agreed, "but the matter was not especially difficult. The Foreign Office dispatch case in your left hand bears a cipher stamp that has been used by the Under-Secretaries since Palmerston's day. Your cufflinks carry the Ainsworth crest, which I had occasion to examine in Burke's last spring in connection with an entirely unrelated affair. As for the memorandum, you have not come to consult me upon anything less. The ink upon your right cuff is still faintly tacky, which suggests you were writing under some urgency within the last 2 hours, and the cigar smoke upon your coat is not the blend you favour yourself. Virginia, I should think, though you smoke Turkish, which tells me you have been waiting in some anteroom where another man smoked his nerves away before you arrived here. Now do sit down, Sir Percival. The fog will not improve, and Watson has been malingering in that chair for 20 minutes in want of useful occupation." I rose to protest this characterization, thought better of it, and instead fetched a third chair from the corner as Sir Percival Ainsworth lowered himself somewhat mechanically into the one Holmes had indicated. The story which emerged over the following quarter of an hour was told with the clipped precision of a man trained to official communication, though beneath the measured phrases I could hear the steady, low note of genuine fear. Sir Percival was, as Holmes had divined, an Under-Secretary at the Foreign Office, a position of considerable delicacy and no small influence. Some days previous, he heard a confidential memorandum had been prepared under his personal supervision, a document concerning a negotiation of the most sensitive colonial character, touching upon territorial arrangements with a foreign power whose goodwill was, at that particular moment in our diplomatic calendar, of material importance to the Crown. The memorandum had been secured, as was Sir Percival's unvarying custom, within a locked dispatch case of the heavier sort, fitted with a Bramah lock of which Sir Percival himself possessed the sole key. The case had rested, as it always did when he was at home, in the locked drawer of his writing desk in the private study of his Kensington townhouse. Yesterday morning the memorandum was there. This morning it was not. The case remained locked. The drawer remained locked. The study window was latched from within. There was no sign of disturbance of any kind. "And the document itself," said Holmes, "should it reach unfriendly hands, or even friendly hands imperfectly disposed toward discretion, what then?" Sir Percival was silent for a moment. "It would imperil a negotiation of the gravest importance," he said at last, "and would in all probability end my career." Holmes was quiet for several seconds. His grey eyes were fixed upon some middle distance that appeared to be located slightly above Sir Percival's left shoulder. Then he unfolded himself from his chair with the sudden energy that always surprised those who had not yet learned to expect it. "Watson," said he, "your coat and hat, if you please. Sir Percival, we shall visit your house this afternoon. I have 1 or 2 small questions first. However," he paused with his hand upon the mantelpiece, "the dispatch case. When did you last open it?" "The night before last. I worked late upon a covering note." "And you are entirely certain no impression of the key exists? No wax, no putty, no faithful servant who might have been asked to hold it for a moment?" Sir Percival's jaw tightened. "Entirely certain." "Then," said Holmes, with a glance at me that carried in it the particular species of quiet satisfaction I had come to associate with the commencement of a genuinely interesting problem, "the matter is rather more interesting than a simple theft. Coat and hat, Watson, and do not forget your notebook. In my experience, the truth in cases of this kind hides itself in very small corners, and it is as well to have a record of precisely what we find before other visitors have a chance to improve upon it." Outside, the fog had thickened perceptibly in the short time since Sir Percival's arrival. As we descended to the waiting cab, the gas lamps of Baker Street swam in their halos of yellow murk, and London pressed close around us, vast and muffled and indifferent, keeping its secrets as it had always done. Chapter 2: The Circle of Trust. The cab carrying us through the November murk to Kensington moved at little better than a walking pace, the fog having reduced all of London's confident traffic to a cautious and groping procession. Sir Percival sat opposite Holmes and myself with his hands folded upon the dispatch case in his lap, and his gaze fixed upon some private difficulty that had nothing to do with the grey obscurity beyond the window. Holmes, for his part, had retreated into himself in the manner I knew well from long acquaintance. Not the brooding silence of a troubled man, but the taut, concentrated stillness of a mind sorting and arranging at a rate no outward sign could betray. I occupied myself with my notebook and with the occasional observation of our client, whose controlled agitation told me rather more than he perhaps intended. He was, I thought, a man of genuine probity placed in a position that probity alone could not resolve. The worry upon his face was not the shifty anxiety of a guilty conscience, but the rawer, more helpless distress of a responsible man confronted by a problem that has slipped entirely outside the boundaries of his competence. He had, in short, the look of a chess player who has just discovered that several pieces have moved themselves in the night. The Ainsworth townhouse in Kensington proved to be a substantial property in one of those wide, well-kept streets, where discretion and respectability are practically architectural features. Its white stucco facade and freshly painted railings announced the household of a man who took his position in the world seriously, and the interior, when we were admitted by a manservant of distinguished solemnity, confirmed the impression. The entrance hall was furnished with the restrained good taste that speaks of money, old enough to have forgotten it was ever new. There were no unnecessary ornaments, no fashionable excesses. Everything was precisely adequate to the station of those who lived there and no more. We were conducted to a drawing-room on the first floor, where, Sir Percival informed us with some evident unease, the members of his household had been asked to remain available for the morning. Holmes surveyed the room with a single sweeping glance as we entered, after which his attention appeared to settle entirely upon his own fingernails, a performance I had long since identified as the posture he assumed when he most particularly wished to appear unobservant. There were 4 persons already in the room when we arrived. Lady Margaret Ainsworth rose from her chair to greet us with the measured composure of a woman who has spent many years managing the social obligations of a public career, and has found in that exercise a genuine vocation. She was handsome rather than beautiful, perhaps 10 years her husband's junior, with clear grey eyes that assessed Holmes and myself with a candour that stopped just short of rudeness. She wore her anxiety as she wore everything else, with complete control, though once, when Sir Percival spoke her name, something moved briefly across her face and was immediately suppressed. Mr. Adrian Felton, Sir Percival's private secretary, stood near the window with a sheaf of papers under his arm that he appeared to have carried into the room in an unconscious assertion of his usefulness. He was a neat young man of perhaps 30, with a scrubbed, earnest face, and the kind of attentive stillness that well-trained secretaries cultivate until it becomes second nature. He was, at first impression, the very model of the loyal subordinate, industrious, self-effacing, and equipped with that particular quality of measured helpfulness which the best secretaries share with the best butlers. He greeted us with precise courtesy, offered at once to provide whatever documents or schedules might be required, and named the time of our arrival to the quarter hour in a single conversational aside that I noticed Holmes mark without appearing to. Colonel James Braithwaite occupied the corner of the sofa farthest from Lady Margaret, with the slight but perceptible isolation of a man who is a guest rather than a member of the household. He was a broad, weather-beaten figure in his late 50s, carrying the ruddy complexion and the slight excess of weight common to men of active former careers who have subsequently discovered comfort. His colonial investments were, I later learned, considerable in their original ambition, if not in their present returns, and there was about him in repose a faint atmosphere of financial preoccupation, as though some part of his mind was perpetually occupied with calculations that the rest of him preferred not to acknowledge. He shook Holmes's hand with a directness that was either entirely frank or had been carefully rehearsed to appear so. Miss Clara Linton, Lady Margaret's companion and amanuensis, sat a little apart from the others with a small piece of needlework in her lap which she was not working. She was younger than I had expected, perhaps 26 or 27, with a quiet, intelligent face, and the particular brand of social invisibility that companions in such households learn to adopt as protective coloration. Her presence in the room seemed to register with the others only intermittently, as though she were a familiar piece of furniture that had not yet been noticed to think. I observed that her eyes, however, were neither quiet nor unoccupied. They moved with a steady, private attentiveness across the room, dwelling here and there with a quality that suggested she was accustomed to seeing a great deal more than anyone supposed. Holmes settled into the chair Sir Percival offered him, and began to speak with the easy, inconsequential manner he could assume at will, asking general questions about the household's routine, the arrangement of the downstairs rooms, the habits of the servants. He appeared to find the answers mildly diverting rather than particularly illuminating. Lady Margaret answered with careful precision. Felton supplemented every response with corroborating detail, volunteering the exact times of meals, the names of the kitchen staff, the usual hour at which Sir Percival retired to his study in the evening. The Colonel contributed a frank and cheerful account of his own movements on the relevant evening, which had taken him no further than the dining room and afterwards the smoking room. Miss Linton, when directly addressed, answered briefly and accurately, and then returned to her watchful quiet. It was during a lull in this preliminary exchange that Felton leaned forward with the diffident air of a man reluctantly voicing a suspicion that duty compels him to share. "I hesitate to say so," he began, in the tone of a person who has rehearsed his hesitation rather carefully. "But Colonel Braithwaite has spoken on more than one occasion of his interest in the colonial negotiations currently before the office. It is not my place to suggest, that is, I would not wish to imply, but the Colonel's present financial circumstances are, I understand, somewhat pressed, and the contents of such a memorandum in certain quarters would command a very considerable price." The Colonel received this with a short, hard breath and a reddening of his already considerable complexion, but he said nothing immediately, and the silence that followed was of the charged and eloquent variety. Holmes listened to all of this with an expression of mild, benevolent interest, as though Felton had recommended a particular brand of pipe tobacco, rather than cast suspicion upon a man seated 4 feet away. He asked no follow-up question. He did not glance at the Colonel. He appeared for all the world to be quietly considering the pattern of the drawing-room carpet. But I had been Watson long enough to know what it meant when Sherlock Holmes listened most carefully to a thing without seeming to listen at all. And I had been Watson long enough to notice what he noticed, though often a day or two behind him, which was that Felton's account of everyone's movements had been delivered with a fluency of detail that went somewhat beyond the capacity of ordinary recollection. A man of good memory might recall the sequence of an evening's events. It requires something more deliberate than memory to recall them to the nearest quarter hour. Holmes rose presently and expressed a wish to see the study. Sir Percival led the way, and as we filed out through the drawing-room door I glanced back once. Lady Margaret was watching Holmes's retreating figure with an expression I could not quite classify. Felton was making a note upon his papers. The Colonel stared at the fireplace. Miss Linton's needlework remained untouched in her lap, and her quiet, considering eyes followed us until the door closed between us. Chapter 3. The Empty Dispatch Case. And Sir Percival's study was a room that had been arranged over many years to serve the needs of a particular and disciplined intelligence. It occupied the rear of the first floor, looking out upon a narrow walled garden, now invisible beneath the fog, and it had about it the particular atmosphere of a room in which serious work is regularly done. Not the staged gravity of a room kept for show, but the lived-in purposefulness of a space that is genuinely used. The bookshelves were full, but not decorative. The volumes ordered by subject rather than by binding. The writing desk, a large and solid piece of mahogany stationed beneath the window, was clear of everything except an inkstand, a tray of correspondence, and the dispatch case, which Sir Percival had carried from Baker Street, and now restored to its position with the care of a man returning an object to its rightful altar. Holmes stepped into the room ahead of us and stood quite still for a moment in the centre of the hearthrug, turning his gaze slowly from one wall to the next with the unhurried attention of a man reading a document rather than inspecting a room. I have observed this behaviour on many occasions and have never entirely accustomed myself to it. There is something almost unsettling in the quality of Holmes's scrutiny when it is fully engaged, a sense that the room is being read in a language the rest of us have never been taught. He began at the door and worked inward. The lock was of good quality, he noted, and showed no scratches about the keyhole beyond those consistent with ordinary use. The hinges were tight. The hearthrug, a thick Turkey carpet of dark red and navy, was slightly displaced from its usual position, as betrayed by the darker, undisturbed border of the bare boards around it. But the displacement was small, a matter of an inch or two, and could as easily have been caused by the passage of many feet since the previous evening as by anything more deliberate. The writing desk received more sustained attention. Holmes examined the Brahma lock of the dispatch case, holding it briefly to the light from the window, and then set it down with a small nod that conveyed nothing I could interpret. He examined the inkstand next, a handsome piece of porcelain in the Chinese manner, lifting it with both hands and turning it with a slowness that suggested he was looking not at the object itself, but at whatever lay beneath or around it. He set it down in precisely the same position and said nothing. It was the hearth that held him longest. The fire had not been lit that morning, Sir Percival having been in no state to concern himself with domestic comforts since making his discovery. The grate was cold, and within it, among the grey residue of an earlier fire, Holmes found what he was looking for. He did not announce the discovery. He crouched beside the grate with his lens and spent perhaps 2 minutes in a silence broken only by the distant sound of a coal cart in the street beyond the garden wall. Then he rose, and I saw that he held between his thumb and forefinger a small and blackened fragment of paper, roughly triangular in shape, perhaps an inch at its widest, with one straight edge that had been cut rather than torn, and a curling, charred margin that spoke of something larger having been burned to near completion. "Envelope," said Holmes, almost to himself, turning it once in the light. "Good quality rag paper. The straight edge is the upper flap. Someone with a very thorough instinct opened it, read what was within, and then burned it, but not with entire success." He placed the fragment with some care into his pocketbook. The desk edge provided the second discovery, though Holmes's manner of finding it was so natural that I nearly missed the moment entirely. He was running one finger along the underside of the desk's front edge, apparently in idle thought, when he paused and brought his lens to bear upon a point approximately a foot from the right-hand corner. I leaned closer and could just distinguish, in the grain of the polished wood, a faint smear of some reddish-brown substance, waxy in texture, no larger than a thumbnail. "Sealing wax," said Holmes without being asked. "Dark red, the same shade as that used upon the Foreign Office's standard internal correspondence. The desk has been recently polished. Mrs. Hudson would approve of the household staff in that respect, which means this smear is recent, a week at the outside, more probably 2 or 3 days. "Someone opened and resealed a document here," I said. "Someone opened and resealed a document here," Holmes agreed, in the slightly flattened tone he used when confirming an observation that he regarded as elementary, but was too courteous to say so. "The question of whether it was the same person who subsequently burned the envelope is, for the moment, open." Sir Percival had remained near the door throughout this examination, watching Holmes with the silent, fixed attention of a man who does not wish to disturb a surgeon at work. He spoke now, quietly and with great care. "Is it possible, Mr. Holmes, that the document was removed and replaced before being taken finally? That someone examined it, returned it, and then thought better of matters?" "It is more than possible," said Holmes. "It is, on the present evidence, rather the most probable sequence. He had moved during this exchange to the window, and it was there that the third discovery was made. The sash was latched as Sir Percival had confirmed, and the latch itself was tight. But Holmes, pressing his lens to the lower corner of the inner pane, found a faint disturbance in the film of condensation that had gathered overnight upon the glass. Not the clean, unbroken grey of an undisturbed surface, but a slight smearing, a partial clearing, of the kind left by a hand pressed flat against the pane from inside. "This window," said Holmes, straightening, "was not approached from without. The condensation on the outer surface is entirely undisturbed, and in any case we are on the first floor with no convenient purchase below. Someone stood here, inside this room, and pressed their hand to this glass. Given the direction and character of the smear, I should say they were steadying themselves while leaning across to examine something on the sill or the desk edge nearby." He paused, glancing down at the sill itself. "There is nothing on the sill now, but the dust, such as survives the household's admirable standards, has been disturbed at this point and this point only." It was then that I noticed, or rather then that Holmes allowed me to notice, that he was pocketing a second small object with the unhurried ease of a man picking up a coin he has dropped. He said nothing about it, and I asked nothing. I had learned, over the course of many investigations, that Holmes would account for each detail in his own time, and at the moment most useful to his purpose, and that inquiring before that moment arrived produced nothing except a mildly withering observation about the inadvisability of forming conclusions before one had assembled all the evidence. We were interrupted at this juncture by the arrival of Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, who had apparently been summoned by Sir Percival that morning in addition to ourselves, and who entered the room with the brisk proprietorial air of a man arriving at a scene he considers to be already substantially solved. "Ah, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade in the tone of a man acknowledging an eccentric but occasionally serviceable acquaintance. "I thought I might find you here. Sir Percival." He cast a swift professional eye around the study. "I've had my men making inquiries since this morning, and I think the matter is rather clearer than it might appear. Colonel Braithwaite, as you may know, has recently sustained some very considerable losses in his East African ventures, and we have it on good authority that he has been in communication with certain parties whose interest in Foreign Office business is of a nature I need not specify." He settled his hat under his arm with the comfortable satisfaction of a man laying a winning hand upon the table. Holmes received this intelligence with an expression of mild and courteous approval, the precise expression I had noticed over the years that he reserved for promising theories which he believed to be fundamentally mistaken. "That is most suggestive, Lestrade," he said pleasantly. "Most suggestive indeed." And his eyes, over the inspector's shoulder, returned once more to the porcelain inkstand upon the desk, and rested there with a quality of quiet, particular attention that I found, by the time we descended to the hall, quite impossible to dismiss. Chapter 4. Statements and Silences. Lestrade, once established in the study with the comfortable authority of a man who considers the premises to be operationally his own, produced a notebook of the regulation pattern, and proceeded to take formal statements from each member of the household in turn. Holmes did not object to this arrangement. He withdrew to the window seat, produced his pipe, was reminded by Sir Percival's expression that the study was not the drawing-room, and consoled himself with his fingertips pressed together beneath his chin, his long legs extended before him, and his eyes 3/4 closed. To a casual observer he might have been asleep. I knew better, and so, I suspected, did Lestrade, though the inspector gave no sign of it. Lady Margaret was admitted first. She seated herself opposite Lestrade's temporary desk with the straight-backed ease of a woman who has given evidence before parliamentary committees, and find Scotland Yard inspectors correspondingly unintimidating. She had heard nothing unusual on the night in question. She had retired at 10:30, having spent the earlier part of the evening in the drawing-room with Miss Linton, while the gentlemen remained at table. She had not entered the study at any point after dinner. Her manner throughout was precise without being cold, cooperative without being eager, and so thoroughly unremarkable that I found myself paying close attention to the moments of silence between her sentences, where something unexpressed seemed to collect and then, with visible discipline, to disperse. Holmes asked only one question when Lestrade had finished, directing it toward Lady Margaret with the politely abstracted air of a man raising a detail that has only just occurred to him. "Lady Margaret, you mentioned the drawing-room. Was the connecting door to the corridor open or closed during the evening?" "Closed," said she without hesitation. "Thank you," said Holmes, and appeared to lose interest entirely. Miss Clara Linton entered with the quiet self-possession that I had observed in the drawing-room and took her chair with a composure that was of an entirely different character from Lady Margaret's. Where Lady Margaret controlled her manner as deliberate exercise, Miss Linton appeared simply to inhabit hers, as though composure were her natural condition rather than something maintained by effort. She corroborated Lady Margaret's account of the evening and its essentials, and added one detail of her own, which she offered without prompting and with the straightforward manner of a person who considers it simply relevant. "At some point between 9:30 and 9:45, she said, a draught had entered the drawing-room with sufficient force to extinguish the candle nearest the door. She had risen to relight it. The draught, she believed, had come from the direction of the corridor, suggesting that a door somewhere along it had been opened and closed. Lestrade wrote this down with the satisfied air of a man receiving confirmation of a theory he already held. Holmes, from his window seat, opened his eyes to their full extent for approximately 4 seconds, and then closed them again. Colonel Braithwaite gave his account with the slightly overloud confidence of a man who is aware that suspicion has been directed toward him and is determined to meet it head-on, rather than give it any additional purchase. He had dined. He had smoked. He had played a hand of patience in the smoking-room until past 11, as the butler could confirm. He had not been in or near the study at any point in the evening. He was acquainted, in a general way, with the nature of the colonial negotiations currently before the Foreign Office, as any man of his background and experience might reasonably be, but he denied absolutely any interest in the specific contents of the memorandum, and received the suggestion that he might have communicated with foreign agents with a forthright indignation that struck me, for what it was worth, as genuine. Lestrade was unmoved by the indignation. He concluded the interview with a slightly too neutral courtesy of a man reserving his judgment for a later and more decisive occasion. Felton came last. He sat down, arranged his papers with the habitual neatness of a man who brings order to every surface he occupies, and gave his account in the same fluent, methodical manner that had struck me in the drawing-room. He had been at work in his own small office adjacent to the study until shortly before 9, he said, at which point he had gathered the papers he required for the following morning. I locked his office and gone upstairs. He had not re-entered the study or the corridor off which it opened. He was able to state with the precision that characterised all his utterances that he had heard Sir Percival's step upon the stair at 9:17, that dinner had been called at 7:45, that the Colonel had excused himself from the drawing-room at 8:52. Holmes, who had given every appearance of being absorbed in the study of the cornice, spoke without turning his head. "Mr. Felton, you're evidently a man of excellent habits of observation. Tell me, when you locked your office at 9, was the inkstand upon Sir Percival's desk in its usual position?" There was a pause of perhaps 2 seconds before Felton answered. "I did not enter Sir Percival's study at that hour," he said. "I had no occasion to." "Of course not," said Holmes pleasantly. "I only wondered whether you might have glanced in as you passed. The door, I take it, was closed?" "Closed," said Felton. "I had no reason to notice the inkstand." "Quite so," said Holmes. "Thank you, Mr. Felton." After the witnesses had been dismissed and Sir Percival had been persuaded by Lady Margaret to take some luncheon, Lestrade turned to Holmes with the expression of a man who has been patient long enough. "Well," said he, "what do you make of it?" "I make several things of it," said Holmes, "none of which I am yet prepared to share." "What do you make of it, Lestrade?" The inspector closed his notebook with a snap. "Braithwaite," he said, with the decisive brevity of a verdict already returned. "Motive, presence, and a character that isn't above lending his inside knowledge to whoever will pay most for it. The draft the companion mentions, that was him, moving through the corridor to the study while the ladies were occupied and the butler was below. The telegraph inquiries I've set in motion will settle the matter before long." "They may," said Holmes, "and they may settle rather more than you currently anticipate." Lestrade received this with a short, good-natured scepticism and departed to pursue his inquiries, leaving Holmes and myself alone in the study for the first time. The change in Holmes was immediate. The languid, half-attentive figure of the past 2 hours folded itself away, and in its place was the man I had watched at work in a dozen cases before this one, sharp, quick, and entirely purposeful. He crossed to the desk without preamble, examined the inkstand a third time, lifting the lid and bending close to the interior with his lens. "There," he said softly, and I understood from the word that he had confirmed something he had suspected since our arrival. He did not enlighten me further, but he took from his waistcoat pocket the small object I had seen him pocket during our earlier examination, and held it beside the inkstand in the grey November light. It was a matchstick, short and blackened, its head struck cleanly off. He turned it once between his fingers, comparing something in its character with what he saw before him, and then replaced it in his pocket with the satisfaction of a compositor fitting the last piece of type into a form. "Holmes," said I, my patience having reached its natural limit, "you might at least tell me whether we are looking in the right direction." He straightened and gave me the thin, quick smile that, in another man, might have been called triumphant. "We are looking," said he, "in precisely the wrong direction, which is an excellent place to begin. I shall need this evening to be certain, but I believe, Watson, that before this matter is concluded, Lestrade will have occasion to revise a very confident opinion, and one member of this household will find that a reputation for perfect helpfulness is rather more dangerous a possession than it first appears." He picked up his hat and gloves from the chair where he had set them, glanced once more at the hearthrug, the ceiling wax smear, and the latched window in the sequence of a man reviewing a completed passage of argument, and moved toward the door with the particular lightness of step that told me the problem, in all its essential lines, had already been solved. Chapter 5. Motives in Shadow. We returned to Baker Street in the early afternoon, the fog having thinned somewhat during our hours in Kensington, without quite resolving itself into anything that could honestly be called clarity. The city appeared in that intermediate state peculiar to November afternoons, neither properly dark nor properly light, the gas lamps already burning in the shop fronts, though a pale and unconvincing residue of daylight still lingered above the rooftops. Holmes said nothing during the journey. He sat with his chin at his chest and his hat pulled forward, and I had sufficient experience of that posture to leave him entirely undisturbed. Back in our sitting-room, Mrs. Hudson brought tea, which Holmes ignored, and I consumed with the appetite of a man who had been too absorbed in other people's difficulties to remember his own luncheon. Holmes stood at the mantelpiece for a time, then took his violin from the sofa, drew the bow twice across the strings in a way that suggested he was considering music rather than actually producing it, and set it down again. He pulled his clay pipe from the rack, filled it with the slow deliberateness that meant his thoughts were moving quickly, and stationed himself in his armchair in a posture of such extreme physical relaxation that I knew he was engaged upon something very strenuous indeed. I had my notebook open and my pen in hand, it having long been my habit to organise my impressions of a case while they retain their freshness. I had written perhaps half a page when Holmes spoke, not to me directly, but in the manner of a man thinking aloud who happens not to be alone. "Braithwaite's investments," he said. "You noticed the Colonial Gazette folded in his coat pocket?" "I did," said I. "The East African Consolidated Land Company. If you consult the exchange reports from the last quarter, you will find they have fallen to approximately a third of their issued value. Braithwaite holds, at a conservative estimate, some £4,000 in that stock. He drew upon his pipe. A man in that position, with a colonial memorandum at hand, might find a foreign intermediary willing to pay handsomely for certain advance intelligence regarding territorial dispositions. Then Lestrade may not be entirely wrong, I said. Holmes turned his head toward me with an expression that managed to be simultaneously patient and faintly reproving. Lestrade is never entirely wrong, Watson. That is what makes him so consistently misleading. He gathers the available evidence, identifies the figure toward whom it most obviously points, and stops. The art, if I may be permitted to call it that, lies in understanding why the evidence points so obligingly in one direction, and what inconvenient facts lie just outside the frame of the picture Lestrade has chosen to examine. He was silent for a moment, and then, Lady Margaret. Yes. She mentioned in passing, when I engaged her briefly in the corridor after her interview, that she had known the colonial secretary in a previous capacity. She used the phrase with the careful casualness of a woman who has decided in advance precisely how to introduce a subject she would prefer not to have arise unexpectedly. I set down my pen. You think she has some reason to fear the memorandum's contents independently of her husband's career? I think, said Holmes, that a politically astute woman who has navigated the Foreign Office's social currents for 20 years does not fear documents at random. The memorandum touches upon colonial negotiations. The colonial secretary is a man with whom she has a previous connection she describes with care. Whether that connection is innocent or otherwise, the combination produces in her a degree of anxiety that goes somewhat beyond wifely concern for Sir Percival's position. He examined the bowl of his pipe. It is a motive for concealment rather than theft, but concealment and theft occasionally arrive at the same address by different routes. And Miss Linton? I asked. Holmes rose from his chair and moved to the desk, where he had placed the fragments recovered from the study alongside several reference volumes he had consulted upon our return. Miss Linton, he said, drawing out the words with a measured thoughtfulness, is more interesting than she first appears. Before her present position with Lady Margaret, she was employed for 2 years as secretary to a Mr. Hargreaves Pell, who served as private adviser on colonial affairs to the opposition front bench. The position ended, according to the private register I keep of such appointments, approximately 18 months ago, at which point she entered Lady Margaret's service. I considered this. She has knowledge of the opposition's interest in the negotiations. She has knowledge, Holmes corrected mildly, of one side's reading of the negotiations. Whether that knowledge has any present relevance I cannot yet say. What I can say is that Miss Linton's draft, the candle extinguished in the corridor, is the one piece of testimony that none of the other witnesses corroborates or contradicts, and that she offered it with a precision of time that rivals Felton's own. He returned to his armchair and picked up the matchstick from the desk as he passed, turning it in his fingers for what I estimated was the 4th or 5th occasion since our visit to the study. I waited. A pipe smoker, I said at last, unable entirely to contain myself. Holmes glanced at me with what might in a more demonstrative man have been called approval. Struck downward, Watson. Observe the scoring on the head. The friction mark runs from above, not below. A man who lights a candle or a gas jet draws the match upward against the striking surface in a natural lifting motion. A man who lights a pipe inverts the action, drawing downward to guide the flame into the bowl. It is not a universal habit, but it is a consistent one, and once formed, it does not alter under stress or in the dark. He set the matchstick down upon the arm of his chair. No one in the household smokes a pipe save one person, and that person has stated with considerable fluency that they were not in or near the study that evening. He would say no more upon the subject that afternoon, and I didn't press him. Instead, as I occupied myself with the exchange reports, which confirmed in every particular his assessment of Colonel Braithwaite's financial embarrassments. The Colonel's position was considerably worse than I had supposed. Several additional investments in southern mineral concerns had fared no better than the East African stock, and the cumulative picture was of a man who had ventured a comfortable fortune into the expanding colonial enterprise and watched it contract with the market's indifferent efficiency. It was shortly before 6, the fog having returned in full force, and the street below reduced to a row of blurred amber lanterns, that Holmes returned from what he described only as a short errand and sat down to supper, with an appetite suggesting the errand had been satisfactory. Over cold beef and mustard he remarked, as though continuing an earlier conversation, that the study of a man's movements in a familiar room was an exact science requiring precise measurement, and that he intended to return to Kensington after dark. I said I would accompany him. "I had rather you did not," said he, pleasantly but with finality. 2 pairs of feet in a room where I need to reproduce the behaviour of one are 2 pairs too many. Besides, he added, with a sidelong glance that carried in it a trace of genuine amusement, "I shall need you fresh tomorrow, Watson, and you have the look of a man who requires 8 hours and a clear conscience to function at his best." I protested this characterization, but not with any great energy, and by 9 o'clock Holmes had gone out, and I had settled by the fire with the day's accumulated impressions arranged in my notebook as neatly as I could manage. I wrote for perhaps an hour, reviewing each member of the household in turn, their postures, their phrasings, their small evasions and their areas of apparent candour, and found that the more carefully I considered the whole, the more a single figure moved, almost imperceptibly toward the centre of the picture. The fire burned low. Outside, London pressed its foggy indifference against every window in Baker Street. I closed my notebook and thought about Adrian Felton and his 30-second accounts of other people's evenings, and the matchstick that a man who did not smoke a pipe had apparently struck in a room he had not entered, on a night when nothing whatsoever had occurred. Chapter 6. The Hidden Anxiety. Holmes was back in Baker Street before midnight. I know this because I had not, despite his estimation of my habits, managed anything approaching proper sleep, and heard his step upon the stair at 20 minutes to 12, lighter than usual, with the particular quality of controlled energy that meant he had found what he went to look for. He did not knock at my door, and I didn't call out, but I lay awake for another hour listening to the faint movements from the sitting room below, the creak of his armchair, the scratch of a pen, the periodic soft percussion of his pipe being knocked against the grate. Whatever conclusions his nocturnal visit to Kensington had produced, he was evidently committing some portion of them to paper, and I resigned myself to receiving the rest in the morning at whatever hour and in whatever sequence he saw fit. He was at the breakfast table when I came down, already dressed and alert in that slightly electric way that characterized his better mornings, the toast untouched but the coffee considerably depleted. Spread before him were his notes from the previous evening, several sheets covered in the compressed angular hand he used when writing for himself, rather than for any reader, and alongside them the recovered matchstick, the fragment of burned envelope, and a small diagram which I took to be a floor plan of some part of the Kensington study, rendered with the neat accuracy of a man who has spent time in a room with a tape measure as well as his eyes. "You went back with a tape," I said, seating myself and reaching for the coffee pot. "The distance between the fireplace and the writing desk is 4 feet and 7 inches, said Holmes without looking up. "The hearthrug extends 2 feet from the grate. The desk chair, in its normal position, is 14 inches from the desk edge. The chair as we found it yesterday morning was displaced 3 inches to the right and 2 inches forward of that normal position." He turned one of his sheets to face me and indicated the diagram with his pen. A man of average stature seated at that desk in the displaced position would find his right hand reaching the inkstand with a slight but perceptible extension of the arm. A man seated in the normal position would find it comfortably within reach without extension. I studied the diagram. Someone sat at that desk who was not accustomed to its arrangement, or someone sat at that desk in circumstances that required them to lean rather than sit squarely, reaching rather than working, examining rather than writing. He capped his pen and pushed the diagram aside. "The inkstand, Watson. I examined it a 3rd time last night by lamplight, which was rather more revealing than the window light of yesterday afternoon. He rose and went to the mantelpiece, from which he produced the porcelain inkstand itself wrapped in a square of cloth. I stared at it. "You took it?" "I borrowed it, with Sir Percival's knowledge, and at his request, when I called upon him briefly at 9 o'clock last evening. He is a man of sufficient intelligence to understand that an object which holds evidence should not remain in a room to which several people have access." Holmes set the inkstand on the breakfast table between us and lifted the lid. "Look at the interior, the lower right quadrant of the base." I looked. The porcelain interior of the inkstand was of the standard pattern, glazed white, with the dried residue of ink that accumulates in any vessel of regular use. But in the lower right corner, just at the join between the base and the side, there was a faint impression in what appeared to be dried sealing wax. Not a smear, as we had found upon the desk edge, but a partial print, the rounded pad of a thumb rendered in dark red wax and pressed there with sufficient clarity to show the broad lines of the pattern. "The wax was soft," said Holmes, replacing the lid and sitting down, "when this impression was made. Soft enough to take a print, which means it had been very recently melted. The inkstand was used as a rest. Something placed upon it momentarily while still warm, a stick of sealing wax cooling after use, or a document, folded and freshly sealed." "The memorandum," I said, "removed from the dispatch case, resealed after examination, and rested upon the inkstand while the wax set." He buttered his toast with the brisk efficiency of a man who has been working since before breakfast, and intends to continue. "The sequence becomes clearer. The document was taken from the case, read or copied, resealed with the Foreign Office's dark red wax, and set upon the inkstand to cool and harden before being replaced. That accounts for the smear upon the desk edge, where the document was laid flat, and the impression in the inkstand's interior, where the stick of wax was rested. It also accounts for the slight displacement of the dispatch case within the drawer, which Sir Percival mentioned but did not emphasise, attributing it to his own hurried handling the previous evening. But Sir Percival has the only key," I said. Holmes looked at me over his toast with an expression I recognised as the precursor to an important statement. "He believes he has the only key," said Holmes, "and in the strictly material sense he is correct. The Bramah lock shows no evidence of having been forced or picked. But a Bramah lock, Watson, is not the only means of securing a dispatch case, and a key is not the only means of opening one. If a second impression exists, and a second key has been cut from it." He paused. "Sir Percival is in the habit, when working late, of leaving his coat upon the stand in the corridor outside the study, the key in the breast pocket. The coat hangs there for perhaps 2 hours of an evening. It requires less than 90 seconds to take a wax impression of a key." The implication settled over the table with the quiet definitiveness of a fact that has been long established and is only now being formally introduced. "Felton," I said. Holmes neither confirmed nor denied it, but he set down his toast and said, "I also paid a call last evening upon a locksmith in Holborn by the name of Garvey, who maintains records of his commissions as most reputable craftsmen do. Mr. Garvey could not discuss any specific commission without rather more formality than 9 o'clock permitted. However, he was not unwilling to confirm in a general way that a gentleman answering a certain description had visited his establishment some 3 weeks ago. The commission he indicated was for a duplicate key of the Bramah pattern. 3 weeks ago, I said, before the memorandum was even drafted. Which suggests, said Holmes, a degree of premeditation rather at odds with the impulsive opportunism that Lestrade's theory of the Colonel requires. He stood and went to the window, looking out at Baker Street, which was showing for the first time in several days a tentative strip of pale sky above the rooftops. "And there is one further thing, which I confess I find the most interesting of all." He returned to the table and lifted the fragment of burned envelope from among his papers. "I examined this last night under the lens. The paper, as I noted previously, is high-quality rag, cut along the upper edge. But here, at this corner, there is a trace of print, a partial letterhead, too incomplete to read but sufficient to establish that the envelope originated not with the Foreign Office, as I first assumed, but with a private correspondent. The ink of the letterhead is of a blue-black commercial variety, quite different from the Foreign Office's standard supply. He set the fragment down with the precise care of a man placing a chess piece that changes the nature of the game. "Someone received a private letter in this house," I said slowly, "and burned it in Sir Percival's study." "Someone received instructions," said Holmes with a quietness that was more emphatic than any raised voice, "and disposed of them in a room they were not supposed to have entered." He moved toward the door, then turned back with his hand upon the frame. "We shall visit the Kensington house again this afternoon, Watson. I wish to speak privately with one or two members of the household, and I wish to be present when Lestrade shares the results of his telegraph inquiries." He allowed himself the faintest suggestion of a dry smile. "They will be illuminating, I have no doubt, though not, I suspect, in quite the direction Lestrade intends." Chapter 7. The Obvious Culprit. We arrived at the Kensington house shortly after 2 o'clock to find that Lestrade had preceded us by half an hour, and had already arranged the household in the drawing-room with the proprietorial efficiency of a man who considers the conclusion of his investigation to be a matter of paperwork rather than of substance. He met us in the entrance hall with an expression compounded of professional satisfaction and a certain theatrical restraint, the look of a conjurer who has palmed the card and is now waiting for the appropriate moment to produce it. "I am glad you have come, Mr. Holmes," said he, with the magnanimous warmth of a man who can afford generosity. "The telegraph results arrived at noon. I think you will find them decisive." Holmes indicated with a gesture that Lestrade should precede us up the stair, and fell in behind him with the mildly attentive expression of a man at a lecture whose interest is polite rather than absorbed. The drawing-room held its now familiar cast of figures, but the atmosphere had altered perceptibly since our previous visit. Something had shifted in the arrangement of the household's anxieties, as though a weight which had been distributed unevenly across several people had begun, in the last few hours, to concentrate itself upon one. Colonel Braithwaite sat in the same corner he had occupied the previous morning, but where yesterday's isolation had carried something of deliberate self-sufficiency, today's had the different and less comfortable quality of a man who perceives that the space around him is not of his own choosing. Lady Margaret watched Lestrade's entry with the controlled attention of a woman who is following the progress of an event she regards with private misgiving. Miss Linton's needlework was in her lap again, and again untouched. Felton stood near the window in his customary attitude of useful proximity, his papers under his arm, his face expressing the appropriate mixture of concern and quiet readiness. Sir Percival rose when we entered, and crossed to Holmes with a directness that made it plain the drawing-room formalities were not his first concern. "Mr. Holmes," said he in an undertone, "Lestrade has indicated that he intends to put certain questions to the Colonel in a very particular way. I should be grateful for your view of the matter before he does so." "I shall observe with great interest," said Holmes, in a tone that held rather less reassurance than Sir Percival appeared to be seeking. Lestrade placed himself before the fireplace with the unconscious instinct of a man who prefers to occupy the commanding position in any room, opened his notebook to a marked page, and addressed the Colonel with the careful courtesy that British law enforcement reserves for moments of incipient accusation. "Colonel Braithwaite," said he, "I have before me the results of inquiries made to the Central Telegraph Office regarding transmissions originating from the Praed Street office on the 9th and 11th of this month. On the 9th, a telegram was received at that office for dispatch, addressed to a Mr. Hendricks of Rotterdam. On the 11th, a reply was received from the same source. The Colonel's jaw had tightened by the time Lestrade reached Rotterdam, but he did not speak. The sender on the 9th gave his name as Rawlings," Lestrade continued, "but the description provided by the counter-clerk corresponds in material particulars to your own, Colonel, and the content of the message, though couched in commercial language, has been assessed by colleagues of mine with relevant expertise as consistent with an inquiry regarding the value and terms of certain political intelligence." There was a silence in the drawing-room of the particular quality that follows a public accusation, in which every person present appears to draw a slightly shallower breath. "I did not send that telegram," said Braithwaite. with a flatness of voice that was either the economy of truth or the exhaustion of a man who has run out of more elaborate denials. "The clerk's description," Lestrade began. "I do not dispute the clerk's description," the Colonel said, "because I cannot. I was at Praed Street on the 9th. I sent a telegram to my solicitor in Rotterdam regarding the East African stock, which is a commercial matter of my own, entirely unrelated to anything in this house." His eyes moved briefly to Felton, then away. "That is all I have to say on the subject without my solicitor present." Lestrade was not discouraged. He presented his narrative with the methodical thoroughness of a craftsman proud of his joinery, each plank set squarely upon the last. The Colonel's documented financial distress, his established knowledge of the colonial negotiations, his presence at the telegraph office on the relevant dates, the reply from Rotterdam which his experts had passed as an expression of continued interest in unspecified material. The construction was solid, and I confess that seated in that room, listening to it assembled piece by piece, I felt once again the unwilling pull of its logic, motive, proximity, and a chain of circumstantial evidence that fitted together with the smooth coherence of an argument that has been prepared rather than discovered. Holmes sat through the entire recitation in the chair nearest the door, his legs crossed, his hands in his lap, his face expressing nothing beyond the mild attentiveness of a man hearing a reading of a will in which he has no personal interest. He asked no questions and raised no objections. When Lestrade concluded and looked around the room with the quiet authority of a man resting his case, Holmes produced a small sound of appreciation that stopped just short of being a word. I watched the room rather than the inspector during Lestrade's performance, which had long been my practice in such circumstances on the reasonable grounds that Holmes was better equipped to evaluate the argument than I was, while I might notice things in its audience that he, for once, could not observe from where he sat. What I noticed was this, that Lady Margaret's composure throughout Lestrade's presentation had a quality not of fear on the Colonel's behalf, but of relief, tempered with something more complicated that I could not precisely name. That Miss Linton had ceased her pretence of needlework entirely, and was watching Felton with an expression that had moved past mere attention into something more active. And that Adrian Felton himself, at the mention of the Rotterdam telegram, had produced a small nod, an involuntary, barely perceptible affirmation immediately suppressed, of the kind a man makes when something confirms what he already knew. I wrote it down in my notebook in the moment and underlined it twice. After Lestrade had concluded and the Colonel, white about the mouth but rigidly composed, had been informed that he would be asked to make himself available for further questioning, the household dispersed with a subdued shuffle of people released from a formal occasion. Holmes rose, stretched imperceptibly, and went directly to Felton with the simple directness of a man crossing a room to close a window. "Mr. Felton," said he pleasantly, "I wonder if you would spare me 5 minutes. A small matter of the household routine that I have not yet been able to fully account for." Felton turned with his habitual smile of cooperative readiness. "Of course, Mr. Holmes. Whatever I can do to assist." "Splendid," said Holmes. "Watson, I wonder if you would ask Mrs. Ainsworth's permission to use the small sitting room on the ground floor." I did so, and we installed ourselves there presently. Holmes and Felton in the 2 chairs, myself at the writing table with my notebook open, which Holmes had indicated I should bring by a glance at the door that Felton did not see. The room was quiet and somewhat removed from the upper floors. And through its single window the November sky had turned to the flat, uniform grey of late afternoon. Holmes began with questions of the most general and untroubling character. The household's daily schedule, the arrangement of correspondence, the hours kept by the various members of the domestic staff. Felton answered each with his customary precision, relaxing by degrees into the familiar comfort of his own fluency, and I watched Holmes watch the man with the quiet attention of a naturalist who has identified his subject and is now simply waiting for the confirmation of a behaviour already predicted. It came in the 14th minute, and it was very small, and Holmes let it pass without remark, though I saw his forefinger move once, almost invisibly, against his knee. We shook hands with Felton at the door and descended to the street, where the lamps were already alight, and the evening was closing in from the east with the purposeful efficiency of a London November that has run out of patience with the residual day. "Well?" I said, as we turned toward the main road. "He is a man of remarkable gifts," said Holmes. "His recall is precise, his composure is genuine, and his loyalty, of a kind, is entirely real. But he made one small error this afternoon, Watson, and it is precisely the error I expected him to make." He pulled his coat against the chill. "The innocent do not need to remember what they did not know. Only the guilty must keep an exact account of what they were not told." He said nothing further on the subject that evening, and I did not press him. But I wrote the sentence in my notebook before we had gone 50 yards, and read it over 3 times on the cab ride home. Chapter 8, The Singular Detail. The following morning brought the first genuinely clear day in nearly a week, as though London had finally grown tired of its own fog and expelled it overnight by main force. A hard, bright November light fell across the Baker Street rooftops and lay in clean rectangles upon the sitting-room floor, illuminating with unusual candour the accumulated disorder of Holmes's various projects, the chemical apparatus not yet returned to its proper shelf, the stack of indexed press cuttings partially sorted across the hearthrug, the breakfast things still on the table at 11 o'clock because Mrs. Hudson had twice attempted to clear them, and been twice, in the politest possible terms, redirected. Holmes had been awake before me and showed signs of having been so for several hours. His coat was on, his pipe had been thoroughly used, the ashtray reflecting a night of sustained thought. He stood at the mantelpiece when I came down, holding the matchstick vertically between his finger and thumb at eye level, regarding it with the quiet, final attention of a man reviewing a document he has already committed to memory, but wishes to verify once more. I poured coffee without comment and waited. "I returned to Kensington last night," he said, without preliminary. I had not heard him go out, but this no longer surprised me. Holmes's nocturnal movements had, over the years, developed a quality that was less furtive than simply self-contained. He came and went as the investigation required, and the fact that Baker Street was asleep presented no more of an obstacle to him than the fog. "The study," I said. "The study. I wish to reproduce the act of burning under controlled conditions, and Sir Percival, who is beginning to understand that my methods require a degree of latitude that does not always conform to conventional household management, provided both the access and, at my request, a supply of envelopes of the same stock as that used in the household correspondence." He set the matchstick down upon the mantelpiece and turned from it as a judge turns from a piece of evidence after delivering his summary. "I burned 4 of them," said he. "The first 2 I burned rapidly. The third I burned with the care of a man who wishes to leave nothing. The 4th I burned as the fragment we recovered was burned, incompletely, with an interruption. In each case I used a match struck in the manner consistent with the scoring on our specimen." He picked up his coffee, which I noticed was stone cold, and drank it with indifference. "The interruption, Watson. That is what the fragment tells us. Our man was not careless. He is not a careless man by any measure. The envelope was not incompletely burned through inattention or haste. It was incompletely burned because something stopped him before he had finished. A sound, a step, Sir Percival returning earlier than anticipated. And the match was struck downward, I said. Struck downward and held inverted over the grate, exactly as a pipe smoker holds a match over a bowl. In 2 years of residence in this house, Watson, Adrian Felton has made himself so thoroughly useful to Sir Percival that he has obtained, and by degrees, access to every room, every schedule, every routine of the household. He knows the hour of Sir Percival's return from his club to within 5 minutes. He knew it that evening, and he was still caught. I considered this. What stopped him? Sir Percival mentioned, when I put it to him directly last evening, that he had met Colonel Braithwaite at his club, and left earlier than usual as a consequence of feeling the onset of a headache. He said nothing of this to the household upon his return because the headache resolved of its own accord on the cab journey, and he arrived in tolerable spirits. He was therefore an unexpected quantity in his own house, for the first and perhaps the only time in the relevant period. Holmes moved to the desk and took up the floor plan he had drawn on the morning of the previous day, turning it so that I could see it clearly. When I reproduced the room's arrangement last night, I paid particular attention to the chair displacement. 3 inches to the right, 2 forward. I have measured this repeatedly, and I am confident of it. Now consider. He placed his finger upon the diagram. The inkstand is here, at the right corner of the desk. The dispatch case drawer is here, directly beneath. A man of Felton's build, slight, perhaps 5 feet 9, seated in the normal chair position, has the dispatch case drawer at a natural angle slightly below the line of his right hand. He would sit squarely and work with economy of movement. But the chair was displaced toward the right and forward, toward the hearth. That is not the displacement of a man working at the desk. It is the displacement of a man who has partially risen, or who is seated at an angle, with his attention not upon the desk, but upon the fireplace, burning something. The logic of it settled into place with the quiet irreversibility of a correctly completed proof. He had finished with the document, I said slowly. He had resealed it. He had replaced it in the case. And then he sat down at the hearth to burn the private letter that had given him his instructions, and was interrupted before he had quite finished. Precisely. The document itself was returned to the case. It was only afterwards, when Sir Percival appeared in the corridor and Felton heard his step, that he acted without the calculation that characterises everything else he did. He left the chair misaligned. He left the matchstick. He left the fragment. A man of his precision leaves nothing by accident. He left those things because he did not have time to correct them. I sat back and reviewed in my mind the picture as Holmes had now constructed it. Felton in the firelight, the envelope turning to ash by careful degrees, the sound of a step in the corridor, the abrupt concealment, the studied performance of ordinary industry resumed before Sir Percival's key had finished in the study door lock. And the error he made in our interview yesterday, I said, the one you would not specify. Holmes set down the floor plan and looked at me with the expression of a man who has been waiting patiently for a question to arrive at the right moment. I asked him, toward the end of our conversation, whether he had been aware of any irregularity in the dispatch case's position in the drawer on the morning Sir Percival made his discovery. A minor question, apparently procedural of the kind I'd been asking throughout. He said no, he had not examined the drawer, but then he said, and this is the error, Watson, and it is a small one, but it is exact. He said that the case's position in the drawer varied a little from day to day, and was therefore unlikely to indicate anything significant. I turned this over carefully. He knew the case's position varied. He knew it because he had handled the case. A man who has never touched the drawer cannot know the variability of what it contains. He cannot know it by inference, because there is no inferential route to that knowledge. He cannot know it by report because no one has mentioned it. He knows it only by direct and repeated experience. Holmes's voice had the dry and dispassionate quality of a man reading from a prepared summary. He tried to deflect what he thought was a suspicion by supplying an alternative explanation for any positional irregularity, and in doing so he confirmed that he had noticed the position, which he had not been asked about, and which only someone familiar with the drawer's ordinary contents would think to volunteer. He rose, put on his hat, and gathered his gloves from the side table. "I shall call upon Lestrade this afternoon," said Holmes, "and share 1 or 2 observations which I think will redirect his inquiries. I do not propose to hand him a completed case. That is not my function, and it is not, in this instance, in our client's interest. But I shall ensure that he is looking, before nightfall, in rather a different direction." He paused at the door. "Come with me. Watson, I find your company useful in conversations with Lestrade, as your manifest good sense and obvious capacity for surprise provide a useful indication of whether I am making myself sufficiently clear." I was not entirely sure this constituted a compliment, but I took my hat and followed him down into the clear, hard light of the Baker Street morning, where for the first time in several days the air smelled of something other than coal smoke and coming rain, and the case, which had been assembling itself in darkness and fragments for 3 days, felt at last as though it was approaching the moment at which its completed architecture would be made visible to all. Chapter 9. The Revelation. Lestrade received us at Scotland Yard with the slightly wary cordiality of a man who has learned, through long and occasionally humbling experience, that when Sherlock Holmes pays an unannounced call during the active phase of an investigation, the visit rarely confirms what he already believes. He cleared a chair for each of us with his customary good manners, settled behind his desk with his notebook before him like a shield, and folded his hands with the expression of a man bracing himself to be disagreed with. Holmes did not sit. He stood at the window with his hands clasped behind his back, looking down at the embankment, and spoke for perhaps 12 minutes without interruption, in the level, unhurried manner he used when presenting a completed argument to an official audience. He went through the evidence in sequence: the chair displacement and its measurement, the sealing wax impression in the inkstand, the matchstick and the downward strike, the private letterhead on the burned fragment, the Holborn locksmith and his 3-week-old commission, and finally the error in the interview, Felton's knowledge of the dispatch case's variable position in the drawer. Lestrade listened with the quality of stillness that in him indicated genuine attention rather than mere patience. He made several notes. He did not interrupt. When Holmes had finished, there was a silence of several seconds during which the inspector reviewed what he had written with the expression of a man recalculating a sum he was confident he had already got right. "You're saying," said he at last, "that Felton had a key cut, entered the study, read or copied the document, resealed it with the dispatch case's own wax, replaced it, and then destroyed the letter containing his instructions, and would have left no recoverable trace at all had Sir Percival not come home 30 minutes early?" "That is the substance of it," said Holmes. "And the Colonel's telegraph?" "Is precisely what the Colonel says it is. A commercial inquiry to his Rotterdam solicitor regarding his East African stock. The language has the character of political intelligence only to a reader who is already looking for it. A reader, that is, who has been directed to look for it." He turned from the window. "Someone ensured that the Colonel's visit to Preed Street was known to you, Lestrade, and known in a form that would appear most damaging. That is not coincidence. It is management." Lestrade was quiet for a moment longer, and then he uncapped his pen and drew a line, with the deliberate emphasis of a man formally revising a position through several lines of his previous notes. "I shall want to speak to this locksmith in Holborn," he said. "His name is Garvey, and I have taken the liberty," said Holmes, producing a folded paper from his coat, "of preparing a brief summary of what he told me, together with such additional details as I established through inquiries of my own. You will find the address and a note of the relevant dates at the top of the second page." Lestrade accepted the document with the ungracious gratitude that was his characteristic mode of acknowledgment in such moments, and we departed Scotland Yard with the understanding that he would pursue his revised inquiries with sufficient discretion to avoid alarming the household before Holmes was ready to proceed. That readiness came the following afternoon. Holmes had sent word to Sir Percival that morning requesting that the household be assembled in the drawing-room at 3 o'clock, framing the invitation with the careful neutrality of a man who wishes to produce a particular effect without announcing it in advance. When we arrived, the room held the same cast of principles it had contained throughout. Lady Margaret composed, the Colonel quiet and watchful, Miss Linton with her perpetual needlework, and Felton standing near the window with the slight coiled attentiveness of a man who is uncertain what is about to occur, but has been preparing, in a general way, for something. Lestrade was already present, stationed with professional unobtrusiveness near the door, his hat in his hands and his notebook closed, and Holmes stood before the fireplace in the full light of the afternoon, which gave his angular features a clarity that the fog of the previous days had consistently denied him, and spoke without preamble. "I am going to explain," said he, what occurred in this house on the night of the 8th, and I will ask only that no one speak until I have finished. After that, questions will be entirely welcome." He began with the dispatch case, the Brahma lock and the key. He described the impression in the sealing wax and its implications. He explained the chair's displacement and what it meant about the posture of a man burning rather than working. He identified the matchstick's downward strike as the habit of a pipe smoker, and named the single smoker of pipes in the household without theatrical emphasis, as a man names the correct page of a book he's already read. Throughout this recital, Felton stood where he had been standing when we arrived, his papers under his arm, his face expressing a succession of small, controlled responses that I watched with the close attention of a physician observing symptoms. The slight tightening about the eyes at the mention of the key, the almost imperceptible stiffening of the shoulders when Holmes described the matchstick, and then, as Holmes reached the inkstand and the wax impression, a quality of perfect stillness that was itself, paradoxically, the most telling response of all. It was the stillness of a man who has stopped managing his reactions because the effort of management has become more revealing than the reactions themselves. Holmes paused once, looked directly at Felton, and then continued without altering his tone. He described the burned envelope and its private letterhead. He explained what instructions conveyed by private letter, read and destroyed in a borrowed study, implied about the degree of premeditation involved. And then he set out with a precision that I found almost painful in its thoroughness, the motive, the means, and the sequence. Felton had discovered, in the course of preparing Sir Percival's correspondence some weeks before the memorandum was drafted, the outline of a diplomatic error in the earlier papers, a misjudgment on Sir Percival's part in a previous colonial matter, incorporated into the new document's historical context, which would, if the memorandum were published or examined by hostile eyes, expose his employer to considerable professional censure. Yeah, he had communicated this discovery through a channel whose precise nature Holmes indicated he was leaving to Lestrade's inquiries to fully establish to parties with a direct interest in the content of Foreign Office negotiations. He had obtained a duplicate key. He had planned the act with the care and patience that characterized everything he did. He had entered the study, opened the case, read the memorandum in full, resealed it, and was in the act of destroying the instructing letter when Sir Percival's early return forced him to abandon the grate and resume the appearance of ordinary industry. When he could not subsequently recover the unburned fragment without drawing attention to himself, and when the document itself disappeared shortly thereafter, Sir Percival, panicked by a growing suspicion he could not yet articulate, and having removed it to a second location that morning without telling anyone, Felton found himself unable to confirm to his principals that the destruction was complete, and the entire arrangement began to unravel from its imperfectly burned corner. "The memorandum," said Holmes in conclusion, addressing Sir Percival directly, "was never sold and never transmitted. It was read and resealed by a man who intended to provide a corrected account of its contents, one that excised the compromising historical passage as a demonstration of his value to those who had commissioned him. The original was removed by you, Sir Percival, on the morning you noticed its changed position in the case, a detail so small that you attributed it first to your own handling and then, when the document vanished from its second location during a moment of distraction, to theft of a more conventional kind." The room was very quiet. Holmes turned from the fireplace and looked at Felton with an expression that contained neither triumph nor condemnation, but something that, in its very restraint, I found more final than either. "Mr. Felton," said he simply, "your precision has been, throughout this affair, quite exceptional. It was also, in the end, precisely what gave you away. A man who was not in this room cannot know with such confidence what was not worth noticing." Felton set his papers down upon the side table, with a care that was entirely characteristic of him. He looked at Sir Percival for a long moment, and what passed across his face in that instant was, I believe, genuinely what he subsequently claimed it to be. Then he looked at Holmes and nodded, once with the composed brevity of a man who has lost an argument he knew, from some point in the preceding days that he was going to lose. "My motive," he said quietly, "was Sir Percival's protection. I will not ask you to believe it, but it is true." "I believe it," said Holmes, "which is precisely why the matter is more troubling and not less." Lestrade moved forward from the door. Chapter 10. The Measure of Observation. The days that followed the scene in the Kensington drawing room were of the kind that resist dramatic summary. The machinery of consequence, once set in motion, grinds at its own pace, and without the elegance of the deductive process that preceded it. Lestrade completed his inquiries with a thoroughness that did him credit. The Holborn locksmith confirmed what Holmes had established by inference, and the private channel through which Felton had communicated his discovery was traced, without great difficulty, to a junior functionary in a foreign legation, whose name I am not at liberty to record even at this remove. The broader conspiracy, such as it was, proved considerably less sophisticated than its opening moves had suggested, as is so frequently the case when the most competent participant in an enterprise has been caught before the enterprise reached its conclusion. Adrian Felton did not face criminal prosecution. Sir Percival, after 2 days of private consideration that I imagine were among the more difficult of his professional life, elected to manage the matter through internal channels, were he on the grounds that a public trial would necessarily expose the memorandum's existence, its contents, and the diplomatic misjudgment embedded in its historical preamble, which was precisely the exposure he had engaged Holmes to prevent. Felton resigned his position in a letter of 3 sentences that was, by all accounts, a model of concision. He left London within the fortnight, and I have not heard his name in connection with public affairs since. Whether Sir Percival was right to proceed as he did is a question I've turned over on several occasions without arriving at a settled answer. Holmes, when I put it to him directly on the evening following the Kensington scene, was characteristically precise on the subject of the choice itself, and characteristically silent on the question of its morality. Sir Percival has weighed his obligations to the public interest against his obligations to his own career, and to the discretion of those who depend upon the Foreign Office's continued confidence, Holmes said, from his armchair, his pipe drawing well, and the evening's first fire burning with the steadiness of properly laid coal. He has decided, as men in his position almost invariably decide, in favour of the course that protects the most people by disturbing the fewest. Whether that constitutes wisdom or its comfortable facsimile is a matter I'm content to leave to the moralists. And Felton, I said. Felton believed, and I think sincerely, that he acted in Sir Percival's interests. He also acted in the interests of parties whose aims were not Sir Percival's, and he was sufficiently intelligent to understand the contradiction throughout. The rationalization of self-interest as loyalty is one of the more persistent features of human behaviour, Watson, and one of the most difficult to prosecute, since it is often indistinguishable from the genuine article until the moment it fails. He drew upon his pipe and looked at the fire with the equable, meditative expression of a man who has closed a case in his mind as cleanly as a book. I had my own reflections to make, and I made them over the following days with the slow, accumulative process that is, I believe, the honest alternative to Holmes's instantaneous synthesis. I thought about each member of the Ainsworth household and what the affair had disclosed about the private architectures of anxiety that respectable lives are so often built upon. Lady Margaret's guarded relief at Lestrade's presentation of the case against the Colonel had resolved itself in light of subsequent events into something I understood better from a note Holmes showed me, which she had written to Sir Percival and which Sir Percival had shared in confidence. She had feared, throughout the investigation, that the memorandum's exposure would draw scrutiny to a prior political association she had concealed from her husband, one which had nothing to do with the theft and everything to do with the particular vulnerability of a politically active woman who has made, in an earlier chapter of her life, alliances that a later chapter finds inconvenient. The relief on her face, I now understood, had not been the relief of a woman watching suspicion settle elsewhere. It had been the relief of a woman discovering that the storm had passed over the thing she most feared to lose. Colonel Braithwaite, exonerated by Lestrade's revised inquiries with the efficient completeness that official reversals rarely achieve, recovered something of his former ease within the week. His East African stock remained in its diminished state, the market being indifferent to his vindication, but he bore this with the philosophical resignation of a man who has faced worse than financial embarrassment in the course of a colonial career and emerged intact. He called at Baker Street one morning with a bottle of a remarkably good Burgundy, and the air of a man who wishes to express gratitude without quite knowing how, and Holmes received him with a warmth that I found genuinely pleasing to observe. Miss Linton remained in Lady Margaret's service. Of all the figures in this affair, she was the one who seemed to me, in retrospect, to have seen most clearly from the beginning, and said least. I remarked as much to Holmes, who received the observation with the slight inclination of his head that indicated he considered it accurate. She is a woman of considerable intelligence, operating within very narrow formal constraints, he said. The draught and the candle, that single detail, offered without emphasis, precisely timed and entirely verifiable, was as close as she could come to pointing without pointing. Whether she suspected Felton specifically, or merely knew that something was wrong in a way she could not openly demonstrate, I cannot say. Either way, it was the most useful piece of testimony produced in the entire investigation. I wrote that down as well, adding it to the notes from which I have now constructed this account. We were back in Baker Street on a Friday evening in late November, when I asked Holmes, over dinner, the question I had been turning over since the conclusion of the case. It was not a question about the evidence or the method or the sequence of deductions. It was a simpler question than any of those. "Did you know," I asked, "from the beginning, from the first morning in the study, before you had established half of what you subsequently proved?" Holmes set down his fork with the deliberate patience of a man who has anticipated the question and considered how honestly to answer it. "I knew from the drawing-room," he said, "before the study. Felton's timeline was too exact. An innocent man recollects the character of an evening. A guilty man recollects its schedule." He picked up his fork again. "Everything afterwards was not discovery. It was confirmation. Then all of it, the measurements, the inkstand, the locksmith, was necessary to establish what I knew to the standard required for it to be useful to anyone other than myself." He met my expression with a mild, direct gaze. "Observation is not in itself a public act, Watson. It becomes one only when it can be demonstrated. The distance between perceiving a truth and being able to show it to others in terms they are compelled to accept is the distance across which the entire practice of criminal investigation must travel, and it is considerably wider than it looks from the near side." After dinner he took his violin from the sofa and played for the better part of an hour with the concentrated ease of a man returning, with genuine pleasure, to a thing he has temporarily set aside. I sat by the fire and wrote up the final pages of my notes, the case arranged now in its proper shape, all its parts accounted for and in their places. Outside, Baker Street went about its evening business. A hansom rattled past. The gas lamp on the corner cast its familiar amber circle on the wet pavement. The fog had not returned, though the season gave no absolute guarantee against it, and the night air was cold and clear and sharp, with a smell of river and coal smoke, and that particular compound of stone and damp that is London's own. Holmes drew his bow upward across the strings with the unhurried confidence of a man entirely at home, and the music rose against the dark, and the city continued its unobservant life around us, and I closed my notebook with the small, specific satisfaction of a story fully told. The world is not, as I have had occasion to reflect many times across the years of my association with Sherlock Holmes, primarily endangered by men of bold and obvious villainy. The bold villain is, in his way, a relatively tractable problem. He announces himself by the scale of his ambitions and the violence of his methods, and the machinery of justice, however slowly, is designed to meet him. The greater and more persistent danger is something quieter and more respectable. The well-meaning man who decides, in the privacy of his own conscience, and that he understands the truth well enough to improve upon it, and who acts upon that decision with the full force of his intelligence and the unexamined certainty of his own good intentions. Holmes rose when the last phrase had resolved, and set his violin in its case with the habitual care that was, in him, one of the most consistent gestures I knew. "Bed, I think, Watson," said he, lighting his pipe with a match drawn upward in the clean and ordinary way of a man with nothing to conceal, and the small flame caught and burned steadily, and illuminated nothing more remarkable than a room I knew as well as any I had ever occupied, and a friend I knew better than most, and the comfortable, irreplaceable reliability of the familiar.